So we're here to hear from David Voas, why humanism is the future. And David is Professor of Social Sciences at University College London, where he led the Social Research Institute until 2020. He has senior roles in the European Value Study and various scholarly associations, and serves on the editorial boards of academic journals in his field. His research is mainly concerned with religious change in modern societies based on quantitative analysis of large survey datasets. Please don't forget to tweet along with our hashtag Humanists2023, and we look forward to hearing from David. Please welcome him on stage.
Thank you. Good morning. It's a pleasure to be here in Liverpool, one of my favourite cities in the country. It was actually here some 25 years ago that in midlife I returned to academic life and started my proper career. And now towards the end of it, it's wonderful to be back. I'm going to talk about the future of humanism and the future of religion. And remarkably enough, they're going in different directions. Religion is in decline across the Western world, and that's whether we measure it by believing, belonging, participation in services, the importance people attach to it. Religion is losing ground. Society is being transformed, and the momentum appears to be unstoppable. Now, you might be asking yourself two questions. Is this actually true? And even if it is, could things change? And my answers are going to be, it is true, and no, that isn't going to change. Modernization has predictable and permanent effects, and one of those is what I call the secular transition. This is one of the big social transitions, along with the demographic transition, the movement towards gender equality, for example, that helped to make the modern world what it is. Now, the key fact here is that the pattern of decline isn't that people reach the age of 30 or 40 and then suddenly decide they're not interested in religion or they don't believe in superstitious things anymore. It's that they enter adulthood less religious than their parents were. And then they stay that way. So the consequence is that the older generations are the most religious, they die out, and they're replaced in the population by younger generations. And this process has been going on for several decades, in some countries 100 years or more. Now, as I said, we can see this pattern however we measure religious involvement. Here we go, right direction. Okay, let's just start with some examples. Let's take New Zealand. Now, there was actually a census in New Zealand just a few months ago, but the most recent one for which we have data came from 2018. But it's remarkable, if you look back to census in the 1980s and at people who were born at the beginning of the 20th century, virtually all of them said they had a religion. And now if you look at people born towards the end of the 20th century, we're down to 30%. So that's quite a change. Well, you can see pretty much the same picture however you measure it and wherever you look in the West, but also actually in highly developed societies in East Asia, Latin America, and elsewhere. Maybe you're thinking, well, okay, with affiliation and attendance, that is not unexpected, but what about belief? Even when we look at belief, and even if we look at the United States, let's compare those who were born early in the 20th century with people who were born more recently. And there's an enormous difference between the 3/4 so who say they believe in God and have no doubts about it in the US, in the oldest generation, versus just a third in the youngest. Similar story in Canada. Here the contrast is for religious or spiritual belief, so we're broadening it out, not just conventional religion. And finally in Britain, this is really hot off the press. Some of you might have seen the stories in the paper just, I think it was last week or the week before, from the World Values Survey, in which I'm also involved. This was a study done just last year. And amongst people aged 75 and over, 59% said yes to the question, do you believe in God? Only 17% amongst young adults said the same. Okay, so is it the case that people are just getting more religious with age? Well, no, that's not how it works. It's not an age effect. It's a permanent generation gap. People become reasonably settled in how they identify themselves, what they do in terms of religious practice and belief by about their mid-20s. Now, of course, we all know many people who have either lost faith or returned to faith or come to faith in adulthood. But within any given generation, those gains and losses pretty much balance out, with the effect that you have these generational patterns of religion or non-religion. Okay. So the sorts of questions you might be asking about this secularization thesis, that there's a connection between modernization and religious decline, is, well, isn't it the case that religion seems very strong and persistent around the world? And couldn't it be the case that it's transforming itself rather than declining? Well, religion does seem to thrive more in some places than in others, and people habitually point to the United States as one of those places where it seems to do very well. But even in the US now, there are very clear signs of decline. Likewise, I think the evidence is pretty clear that religion, although it may be changing, is also losing ground. And although people are interested in alternative spirituality and other things, those gains go nowhere near making up for the losses to secularization. Well, so far so good, or so bad, depending on your views about religion. But couldn't things change? Might the popularity of religion in the West rebound? Faith, you would think, would promise benefits that just aren't available from the likes of us. Churches can promise eternal life, being reunited with loved ones, ultimate justice, and that sort of thing. And indeed, some people suggest that humans are just naturally religious and that secularity is a kind of phase we're going through. Well, a lot of people are comfortable with the idea, the sort of Victorian idea of progress, that we're moving towards a destination to becoming the sort of people who are remarkably like us. And although nothing is irreversible, I'd suggest that it's pretty clear things are not going to change. If we look at measures such as the Human Development Index, now this is an index that's produced by a United Nations agency. At the moment, Switzerland is at the top, South Sudan is at the bottom. There's a very high correlation between the position on the Human Development Index and levels of secularity. So long as modernization persists, I think that is going to be the case. Now, there are some countries that are off the trend line. Typically, they're on the Arabian Peninsula, which have a lot of oil wealth, but have modernized quite recently, and socially speaking, they're still very traditional societies. In discussing the impact of modernization, though, I really am looking at the top 40 or 50 countries in the world on this measure. They're mostly North America, Europe, Australia, New Zealand, but also East Asia, increasingly in Latin America. There are a great many countries, though, it has to be said, even up to 140 or 150 around the world, that are still not modernized to the extent that religion has lost ground significantly. What is it about modernization that has this impact? Well, there are all sorts of possible candidates. It would take many more talks to explore them properly, but some of the effects are to do with prosperity, which brings choice, which brings security, Certainly mobility and our comfort with diversity has something to do with it, and the corrosive impact of pluralism on specific belief systems. But that, as I say, is in a sense a matter for another day. What is crucial here, I think, is that it's very hard for religion to bounce back. The secular transition is well-nigh irreversible. Why should that be the case? Well, I think a key reason is that once lost, religion is very hard to bring back. And people who have no religion find it much more difficult to acquire one than people who have been raised in a religion. Let me give you some examples. Think about a religion that isn't your own, and I'm going to assume that most of you, probably well-nigh all of you, are not Hindu. If you are Hindu, or if the Prime Minister has snuck into the back of the room, is that possible? Then, excuse me, just think of a different religion that might not be the one you subscribe to. Well, these are some Hindu deities. These are some Hindu worship practices. They will probably seem very alien and maybe even a little bit scary to you. Now, my point is not that there's anything especially odd about them. It's just that they're not the ones we grew up with. They're cultural practices that we're unfamiliar with and we would find very difficult to adopt because they, in a sense, don't come naturally. So I'm not arguing that there's anything peculiar, especially, about religious belief. It's just that that contemporary culture isn't conducive to the kind of revival that would be necessary to bring it back. Most young people in the West these days grew up without the sort of contact with churches or mainstream organized religion that people of my generation and many of yours will have known, with the result that for them, Christianity is just as alien as Hinduism. Now, again, I'm not arguing that Westerners are all rationalists with a naturalistic viewpoint. You know, on the contrary, half of people continue to believe in God or life after death. The point is that they don't think about it very much. They have no interest in being religiously active. It isn't particularly important in their lives. They don't spend time and energy on it. So this secular transition is well and truly underway. It works via generational replacement. It will continue for many years to come. Nothing is certain when it comes to human beings, but I think there's really no way back for religion in the West. So now let's look specifically at Great Britain. And Ian Scott, the Humanist events organizer, was very keen that I talk about the census because, of course, the census results are just coming out. They're new and interesting. It's something that humanists have long had an interest in, the religion question that goes back 20 years now. And of course, it's somewhat exciting news from our point of view that the Christian percentage, according to the census, has finally dropped below 50%. Well, for those of us who are in the business of looking at religious statistics, this is old news because the British Social Attitude Survey, which started in 1983, has for some time shown the Christian percentage below 50%. In fact, if you look at this purple line here, that's the Christian proportion of the population. It was up around 2/3, according to the BSA survey in 1983, but around 2009 or so, it dropped below the 50% mark. It's down about 38% at the moment, and you can see it's been overtaken by people who say they have no religion, with the non-Christian religions growing steadily towards the bottom of the graph, but still a pretty small proportion of the population. Okay, but the esteem of official statistics is such that the Daily Telegraph and other papers could proclaim Christians now a minority in England and Wales for the first time. That was when the religion results came out in November of last year. Well, why should there be a difference between the census and all of these surveys? One reason is that the census question, what is your religion, is a leading one. It encourages people to choose one. This is something that Humanists UK have objected to for some time. That's combined with the vagueness of the undifferentiated Christian category, which seems a sort of quasi-ethnic classification. But there's, I think, a more interesting puzzle, and that is that the BSA survey shows the decline as being wholly generational. So let me explain what this graph is about. You have the survey years along the bottom horizontal axis, vertical axis is percentage of the population, and then these various colored lines represent decades of birth. So the oldest people born at the beginning of the 20th century are right up at the top, and you can see in excess of 80% of those said they had a religion, and each successive generation is one step down from the one before in terms of religious belonging, until you get to people born in the 1990s, fewer than a quarter of whom regard themselves as belonging to a religion. Now, the interesting thing is that these lines are more or less horizontal in terms of trends. That is to say, people within those decades of birth do not change on average year to year. Yes, there are gains and losses, but those gains and losses balance each other out within each decade of birth. So all of the decline, as shown by the British Social Attitude Survey, is generational. What does that mean? Well, it means that change is very slow because you have to wait for these old people to die out and be replaced in the population by the younger people coming up behind. But it also means it's very difficult to reverse. It's the kind of process where once people are introduced into adulthood not having a religion, they're not going to change, right? They're like these people here who have gone through decades and decades, all with the same average level of religiosity. Okay, well, the census is interestingly different. So here now we see the three censuses for which we've had a question on religion: 2000, 2011, 2021. Again, these are 5-year birth cohorts now, and it is remarkable that even when you look at people just in 5-year intervals of birth, you have this step-by-step generational succession, each line lower than the one before in terms of religious affiliation. But now the lines are not horizontal, they're downward sloping. So what that means is that people who said they were Christian 10 years ago are no longer saying they're Christian, right? Of course, there are many who are still saying they're Christian, but it's not as many as you might have expected. Why is there such stability in the BSA survey measure, not in the census? Well, it's an interesting puzzle. I think the wording of the question certainly makes a difference. The BSA question was probably capturing people who were more strongly identified with the religion, whereas the census was capturing people whose affiliation was sort of weak, unstable. They generally weren't so committed. But it's clear whatever is going on, this generational pattern is a powerful driver of future change. Let's turn to the Church of England now. We have an established church, but it's increasingly a pretty unpopular church. So first, just a few figures again from the British Social Attitude Survey. Back in 1983, 40% said they belonged to the Church of England. It's now down to 12%. If we look at that by age, and remember age reflects generation and generational differences are persistent, in the 75% plus category in 2018, a third of people identified themselves as Anglican. Down in the young adult group, it was 1%. 1% said that they were belonging to the Church of England. Now, what we see amongst young people today is the future. So that's the future of the Church of England, our established church. This is, to me, an even more remarkable slide. I look at the survey results. The samples are generally thousands of people, so we've got 100 or hundreds in any given age group. In this particular age group of 18 to 24-year-olds, in 2014, there were 5 individuals in the sample who said they were Anglican. That was 4 in 2015, 3 in 2016, 2 in 2012. There was one person in the entire British Social Attitude Survey, aged 18 to 24, who said that he or she was Anglican in that year. The numbers have got so low that the National Centre for Social Research that does the British Social Attitude Survey doesn't even release the figures by denomination anymore because they're so low, they're concerned about disclosure. In other words, if you said you were Anglican, you would be such a freak that people could find you, and that would be a bad thing. Okay, now the problem for churches isn't that adults leave, it's that they never joined. So it's a failure, if you like, of religious reproduction. There are a couple of interesting points about religious socialization. One is that it doesn't always succeed in producing religious adults. So there are many, many adolescents who are raised in families where there is some kind of religious education, but it doesn't take, and so they enter adulthood not being religious. But families are still extremely important. In fact, they're probably the most important vehicle for the transmission of religion. Parents who are less religious tend to produce children who are less religious. They go on, of course, in the adult life to be less religious themselves, have less religious families. So there's a kind of feedback effect here. And that feedback effect is having an impact on the future of religion in the UK. Now, there are a number of ways we can measure this. I'll run through them very quickly. We can ask people about how religious their mothers and fathers were. And you can then come up with a scale from 0 to 12, for example, of the religiosity of their parents. You can compare that with their own religiosity, and it's remarkably linear. In other words, there's a strong predictive power in knowing how religious somebody's parents were, seeing how they turned out. Now, there's a lot of regression to the mean. That is to say, the very unreligious parents are more at risk of having children who turn out to be a bit religious, and vice versa. Strongly religious parents don't, on average, transmit all of that. And all of these are averages, but still it's interesting to see how effective that is. The same is true if we look at religiosity versus religious affiliation. I'm going to go quickly now because I want to leave some time for questions, but I think I can get through the remainder here in a few minutes. We can also ask people what qualities they think are most important in raising children. And this is a question that's been done for many, many years. In fact, it was first done in the United States back in the early 20th century. And at that time, people were saying things like obedience is a very important quality for children to have. Well, these days, we tend to put more stress on things like independence and tolerance, and religious faith has pretty much fallen off the charts. So even amongst people who say that they're Christian, only 18% are putting religious faith as one of 5 qualities they think that children really need to learn at home. And even amongst people who say that religion is very important in their lives, fewer than half are making it a priority for children. So again, more signs of decline. How's the Church of England faring? Well, frankly, not very well. It's really becoming a minuscule part of the population. Other churches are also not doing particularly well. Religion as a whole has a rather poor reputation. it's very hard to see where a revival could come from. So there are various findings from surveys, including general lack of confidence in churches. Of course, there's a different picture when we look at other religious groups. The religious landscape is being transformed partly through non-Christian religions, and some 11 or so % of the youngest age groups are now people of Muslim heritage. I think in due course many of them will have no religion, but at least for the foreseeable future they will continue to identify as Muslim, Hindu and Sikh, and so we have an idea of how that's going to affect the religious landscape. And it will have some effect. So here, again from the World Values Survey that was just released very recently, we can compare the age profile of the whole population, that's on the left, with the white British population. So these bars represent age groups, the youngest ones on the left, oldest ones on the right. And if you look first on the right here, the white British population, you'll see that the oldest age group has relatively high levels of belief in God, around 59%. The youngest age group, something more like 17%. Okay, so very steep gradient there. Once you include all the ethno-religious minority groups, that gradient is nothing like as steep. So there is certainly an impact of religious change generally in the UK. All right, I'm conscious that I'm near the time when I wanted to hand over for questions, but let me just refer to an area where humanism is particularly strong, and that's in ceremonies. Now, churches have traditionally been the place where you went for naming ceremonies, baptisms, weddings, funerals. All of those are in decline in the Church of England. Baptisms have pretty well gone off the cliff. Confirmations have totally gone off the cliff. In fact, confirmations will probably disappear as a ceremony. It will be like the churching of women after childbirth, just something that is talked about as a historical artifact. Funerals have been pretty much the last frontier for churches. People traditionally have fallen into the pattern of just going along with the convention, and that some priest would do the honors, but even that is changing, as you know. So, in conclusion, what do we have? We have a situation where religion is declining around the world. That decline is generational, so it's very difficult to reverse. All forms of religion and spirituality are in decline pretty much. In Britain, the Church of England is becoming a minority sect, and the humanist worldview and humanist ceremonies, I think, have a great future before them. They will gradually become the dominant force. So something we might have to look forward to is this. Yes. This will be our next coronation service. All right. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for that. I'm sure we'll all agree that was very interesting, and I know as a public affairs manager that I'll be using, and I continuously use, lots of that data. So let's start with some questions and some kind of ground rules. I'm going to start with women first, because I know that evidence shows that women do, once women ask questions, more women ask questions. And then before you speak, please wait for the mic to be handed to you so everyone else can hear what you're saying. So I can see you've got your hand up there. Can we get a mic over there? Great. And what we'll do is we'll collect 2 questions. So everyone else can raise their hands as well now, and I'll come. Let's go for a question nearby. Okay, 2 questions.
Thank you for your very interesting talk. I just wanted to ask if you've done any work comparing the increase in mental states, psychological difficulties, stress, that sort of thing, whether you've done any comparative studies, whether that increases as religion decreases.
Okay. Do you want to take the same question? Or
Another question? Sit two just behind you.
Thanks. These are very welcome findings. But I'm really a little concerned about whether the questions being asked are still relevant. It seems to me questions about abstractions, such as religion and faith, are becoming increasingly less useful. Why not include some really simple, straightforward questions, such as, do you believe you will re-meet your loved ones after death? I think that would be much more illuminating.
Yep. Okay. So to quickly answer those, there is a good deal of research being done by psychologists of religion on issues like religion or spirituality and stress or mental health generally. I'm afraid that's not my area, so I'm probably not qualified to speak on it. On the second question, I absolutely agree that we do need to broaden our horizons. It's not just about organized religion, it's about worldviews in general, and particularly, if you like, supernaturalist worldviews. Belief in life after death remains remarkably popular, and actually a lot of young people say that they're at least open to the possibility of life after death. I'm frankly not sure why that's the case. I'm intrigued by it. They clearly are not thinking about conventional heaven and hell. They're thinking about the possibility of reincarnation or, for all I know, zombies and vampires. And I think it's a very tentative belief system that doesn't really impinge much on their daily lives. But there is something there about the persistence in interest in life after death that needs to be explored. Thank you.
Right, just hands up so I can see some of the earrings. And from this side, we've got our Humanists UK's president, Adam Rutherford. So has a hand up. Oh, there we go.
Hello. My question is about population, urban and rural, whether any comparison has been made about belief in the Church of England in small rural communities as against the urban environment. Mm-hmm. I've got some experience of small rural communities, and they're still very centred on the C of E way of life.
Mm-hmm. Yep.
Thank you. And we get another question. There you go, got the mic over there. We get a mic to Adam as well.
Yeah, thank you. Is there any correlation at all? So I'm here.
Oh, yes, sorry.
Yeah. Is there any correlation at all between increasing rationalism and the decline of religion? I mean, I'm just wondering how much evidence there is for your claim at the end that a humanist worldview is increasing.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
There's less religion, but is there any more rationalism? There's an awful lot of magical thinking going on, when we look at the news this morning with Trump and Johnson and all their supporters.
Yes.
So that's my question.
Yeah, no, it's a good question. I think the thing I would say there is that change is very slow. We're accustomed to thinking about periods of years, maybe at most decades, and a lot of these changes take decades or centuries. If we compare the kind of worldview that people have now with what was common even a century ago, it's hugely different. I mean, even the Pope is likely to be, in many respects, a secularist compared to a pope from the late 19th century who could still rail against the forces of modernity. Having said that, I take your point. There's an awful lot of superstition about, and I don't think we're especially close to living in a rational, secular, humanist utopia by any means. And in rural communities, absolutely, the C of E remains very strong. It's socially important in many communities. You still find levels of attendance and, of course, the traditional rites of passage and so on much higher there than in suburbs or urban areas.
A question down in the corner, and we've also got Adam, who's got the mic.
Me first?
Go ahead.
Thank you, David. That was an excellent talk. You were primarily talking about the white West, where we're going through a demographic transition in which in most Western countries, birth rates and fertility rates are dropping. But of course, the global birth rate and fertility rates continues to increase and will do for the next 100 years or so. So I'm thinking about countries in West Africa and India, which maintain high degrees of religiosity. So I wonder if you could comment on what the global picture looks like.
Yes. Well, it's certainly the case that worldwide, non-religion is not taking over because the countries that continue to grow through natural increase are the ones that are most religious. There's this close association between fertility and religiosity as there, if you like, patterns of traditional life that mean that sub-Saharan Africa is growing fast. It's also the most religious part of the world. And so you have this sort of odd phenomenon that on the one hand, at an individual country level, you can see signs of secularization setting in many, many places, but in global aggregate terms, religion remains very strong and indeed growing. If you had asked me 20 years ago, I would have just said flat out, it's only in the developed West and maybe in a couple of places in the Far East where you can see secularization. Now we really are seeing it on every continent. So certainly in Latin America, a lot of religious decline there, in a good deal of Asia, much less the case in Africa, but even in Africa, there are humanist and secularist associations that are managing to struggle along even though they're typically suppressed. So I'm not pessimistic looking around the world.
Okay, we have time to pit one more question, so go in the corner.
Thank you. I just wanted to share a challenge that came my way, really, which was I went to the launch of a book in Leeds by a Leeds author called Suhaima Manzoor Khan. And the book's called Tangled in Terror. And it's basically about the experience of Islamophobia from the point of view of a devout Muslim, which is how she introduces herself. And she makes a lot of it is about the prevent strategy and other government policies and their prejudicial effect. But she talks in particular about secularism, which she maintains is nothing but a continuation of the same tendency of Christian evangelism from the 19th century, of trying to impose what we would think of as a superior point of view on people that we regard as backward and primitive. All right? And I noticed in the talk we mentioned modernisation. I would talk about modernisation and advanced societies and so on.
Yeah.
And aren't we open to that accusation that, well, you're just proving my point? And if you go back with, it doesn't mean you're on because.
I'll just ask
but you're proving
keep
my
it
point.
very brief.
That's it.
So, yes, I think we are open to that accusation, and it's an interesting one to discuss. I think there are genuine effects of modernization, and there are real things we can point to that suggest certain values have benefits that other values don't. But it's a big topic and one that we should probably leave to another forum. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Let's all join together to thank you for David.